So in the last lecture, we discussed the first of three popular conceptions of philosophy. Right? Philosophy is the quest for truth regarding the ultimate matters. And these philosophical topics, right, the ultimate matters include, but are not limited to, the existence or non-existence of God, the difference between how reality appears to consciousness and the way reality exists in itself, the problem of determinism and free will, the meaning of justice, the nature of morality, the meaning of mortality, and what attitude we ought to take in the face of our inevitable death, and on and on. And today we'll consider a second popular conception of philosophy. Right? Philosophy is theorizing on how best to live a human life. Now, we often hear talk of someone having developed a, quote, philosophy of life. In other words, they've developed a theory of what it means to live well and a theory of the good life. So for a hypothetical example, we might consider Sam. Right? Sam, a young philosopher, believes that there is actually some real objective truth to be discovered when it comes to the questions, what is human nature, and what does the truly good life look like for a human being? And so Sam devours great works of philosophy and literature, and he develops a theory of what human nature is, and as a result, what real human happiness consists of. Right? Imagine that Sam quits his job at the call center because he's grown to despise the idea of working 40 hours a week, trying to attain some prefabricated conception of success. Right? Now, Sam devotes his life to the attainment of spiritual and intellectual growth. He backpacks the world over, experiencing the wonders that life has to offer, all while continuing to read everything he can get his hands on. Right? He experiments with new hobbies and new projects and discovers passions he never knew he had. Right? Sam has sunk his teeth deep into existence as he meets people from all walks of life and is exposed to ways of thinking and living that are radically different from what he grew up accepting as normal. Right? So Sam has put all these miles on his soul and has grown more as a person in 3 years than most people do in 10 years. And so those who are inspired by his, deliberate style of living say Sam has a beautiful philosophy of life. But the point would be not simply that Sam lives in a certain way. The point is that the way he lives is itself an expression of his philosophical inquiries into the meaning of life. The idea being that Sam had encountered ideas that changed him from the inside out and changed how he wanted to take up his existence. Right? And this is because philosophical ideas had provided him with the intellectual tools to discern the nature of the good life and to distinguish worthwhile desires from the prefabricated, mass-produced desires that are on offer for him and everyone else. Okay, now, on the other hand, let's consider Renee, right? She also has a philosophy of life, but hers is rooted in a sort of nihilism, right? And the philosophical ideas that have gripped Renee have led her to conclude that there is no such thing as human nature, and that life has no objective meaning or purpose which guides how we ought to adopt our desires and our life choices. Right? So she's come to believe that all desires and all life choices are equally valid because in the grand scheme of things, they're all equally meaningless because human existence in the grand scheme of things is meaningless. And so, just like Sam, Renee's philosophy of life, it shapes her politics, her ethics, her desires, and her life choices. You want to be happy? Well, live like the Epicureans and seek simple pleasures, she says, right? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Now, many people have developed, quote-unquote, philosophies of life, as we commonly use the expression. But the important point here is this. throughout history, there have been influential philosophers who have developed compelling arguments and theories about human nature and human existence and what it means to live well. Diogenes, Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, Spinoza, and Nietzsche, Karl Marx, Frantz Fanon, Simone de Beauvoir, just to name a few. And their ideas have influenced the development of the values around which our world revolves, right? The social values, the political values, the moral values, etc., right? So, theorizing on how best to live a human life, this aspect of philosophy and philosophical practice is just really worth emphasizing, because the historically great thinkers whose ideas have shaped our world, they were not solely concerned with this super heady, highly abstract theoretical questions, right, about the nature of reality and knowledge and the meaning of perception, right? The great philosophers throughout history have been equally devoted to the urgent questions of how we as human beings ought to take up our existence and develop a life that is truly worth living. And this is what I want to emphasize here. When we encounter philosophy for the first time, many often experience it as a sort of calling, right? Philosophers scattered throughout history calling us to a radically other form of living and thinking. And this is because the power of philosophical thinking, especially when discovered for the first time, can feel liberating and transcendent, as though the entire world is reborn for you in newness and freshness and mystery. So just, consider our daily lives. We tend to live routine-oriented existences, moving through life on a sort of autopilot. But every now and again, we draw back into ourselves and have a sort of philosophical moment, right? And wonder, what is it all about, right? This might be when we're alone or with a friend, and suddenly we stumble upon the big question that we normally wouldn't think to ask. The question, are there ways of thinking, acting, and living that might be more satisfying and more fulfilling than the ways I think, act, and live today? Now, what this also means is that the attitude of philosophy is sort of characterized by a refusal to automatically accept the presumed legitimacy of the world that is on offer for us. Right? The philosophical attitude is suspicious of the acceptability of the ideas that are used to justify the world's arrangement. Now, historically, this fact has brought philosophers into conflict with the existing social order and existing political authority. In fact, the very origin of the Western philosophical tradition is marked by a deadly confrontation between the philosopher Socrates and the existing social political order of ancient Athens. The state had charged Socrates when he was 73 years old with corrupting the youth, and they executed him, right? Sentenced him to death by poison. So, in some sense, right, philosophy can be dangerous. All right, now, there's also a popular misconception about philosophy that I want to address, and it's the misapprehension that philosophy is just the proliferation of opinions, right? Opinions on the meaning of life, opinions on how we should live, and opinions on all of the other ultimate questions about what happens after we die, or whether God exists, or the nature of reality, or so on and so forth. Now, by an opinion, what is usually meant is an unsupported belief. But if we assume that philosophy is just the proliferation of opinions, well, then no philosopher could ever really be right or wrong. No philosophical position could be better or worse than any other, right? But the reason that this popular conception of philosophy is mistaken is that philosophers do not address the ultimate questions by merely expressing their opinions on the matter. All right, so then what is the method that philosophers use to formulate their ideas if it's not just expressing their opinions? So philosophers rely on argumentation and critical thinking. In other words, human reason. And arguments, unlike opinions, can be better or worse than other arguments. Now, of course, there are two meanings to this word argument, right? First, argument means an oral disagreement, a quarrel, or a confrontation, right? This is the most common usage of the word. But argument also means a process of reasoning involving a set of statements. And these statements function as premises, right, reasons or evidence, and conclusions, statements that are inferred from those premises. An argument is the use of reason in order to establish what is true and to persuade others. Philosophy proceeds through argumentation. And we can just look at a very simple logical argument. For example, this is called a syllogism. So, premise 1, all men, human beings, are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, arguments like this one can be sound or unsound. In a sound argument, two requirements must be met. First, the premises must be true, and secondly, the argument must be valid. That is, the truth of the conclusion must logically and necessarily follow from the truth of the premises, right? So we can go back and evaluate this argument for validity and soundness, right? Are the premises true? Premise 1 and premise 2. Yes, obviously, both premises are true. And then the second question we ask, right, for validity is the question of, does the conclusion necessarily follow from the premises if we assume those premises are true? And yes, if premise 1 is true, that every human being is immortal, and if premise 2 is true, that Socrates is a human being, it logically necessarily follows that Socrates is mortal, right? So this is a sound argument. It has true premises, and the argument itself is valid. Evaluating the strength of an argument requires critical thinking. And practicing critical thinking requires that you learn to identify the premises and conclusions in arguments when you encounter arguments. And then to determine whether or not those premises support the argument's conclusion, right? That's the test of validity. Secondly, critical thinking requires that we evaluate the truth of the premises, and that means evaluating the strength and the reliability of the evidence that's used to support those premises. Now, every single day you are confronted with arguments, but they rarely, if ever, arrive in the form of premise to conclusion arguments like syllogisms. Rather, those arguments appear as political talking points, or social media memes, or campaign speeches, or YouTube conspiracy theories, op-eds, right? Takes on any particular topic at the moment, right? Even commercials and advertisements are arguments, right? They're all trying to persuade us that something is true, right? They're sort of like arguments in disguise. It's up to us as critical thinkers to identify the premises and the conclusions being drawn from those premises that are designed to persuade us. The stronger our critical thinking skills, the better we become at identifying weak premises and faulty reasoning. But critical thinking also requires that we evaluate and critically think about our own beliefs. This means reflecting on our beliefs regarding, say, some important topic, and then asking ourselves, what are the reasons I believe this is true, right? Are the reasons I have for believing it good reasons? Are they bad reasons? I've always believed this is true, but why do I believe this is true? All right, I want to suggest a final conception of philosophy, and that is that philosophy should be thought of as a unique style of consciousness, a unique way of thinking and existing in the world when we draw back into ourselves and wonder, what is it all about, right? Relying on critical thinking to address the topics that come to us in such a mode of consciousness. And on these occasions, where we've drawn back into ourselves, we might begin to ask some very fundamental questions that we normally don't think to ask. And these moments of reflection can happen in any aspect of life, right? It can happen in politics, for instance. So, for example, some of the most basic conceptual categories of contemporary politics are freedom, justice, equality, and democracy. But every now and again, we ask ourselves, yeah, but what do these ideas actually mean? And we might begin to wonder, for example, whether these political principles can conflict with one another. For example, the concept of democracy is meant to imply the idea of equality, but at the same time, democracy is also taken to mean the rule of the majority. So, if the democratic majority strips away the political freedom of a minority group, if it negates that group, right, so they don't have equality, are they still living in a democracy? We can ask whether basic economic arrangements conflict with the basic principles of democracy. For instance, is our economy democratically organized? And if it's not, well, then should it be democratically organized? When we look at the nature of our economy, there is little to no collective or democratic participation in the basic decisions that are made about the use of the most basic resources that are available to a community or to a region. What would it actually look like for communities and neighborhoods and regions to come together and decide collectively on the basic economic questions? Questions like, what sort of goods and resources does our community need? How and by whom should these goods and resources be produced and distributed? How should workers be compensated? Should communities be able to directly vote on such questions? But then again, right, maybe we shouldn't just assume that voting is the defining characteristic of a truly democratic political arrangement. I mean, is democracy and equality really achieved through voting? Does the political power of the people, in other words, find its greatest expression through voting? I mean, we are certainly told that, but when we think about it, it wasn't by voting that Black Americans in this country won the right to vote. It wasn't by voting that women won the right to vote. No, right? Voting rights came as a result of mass social disobedience, rebellion and disruption, and long-term grassroots social and political organizing, where people began to place their political demands on one another as opposed to simply placing their political demands on a kind of ruling political class. So, right, this asks us to rethink the way we normally think about politics and expressions of political power in ways that aren't simply voting. Right, we might begin to wonder still and ask whether our most basic economic institution is in conflict with freedom. Right, is what we consider a free market rooted in a meaningful conception of freedom? I mean, just consider what most of us have to do simply in order to survive. We participate in what's called wage labor. That is, we sell our capacity to perform work in exchange for a wage, and if we don't sell our labor, we very likely starve, right? Because we have been born into this arrangement, we are predisposed to consider this arrangement without having thought about it very much at all to be normal, right, and inevitable. And more, we are told that wage labor is some grand expression of our freedom and our dignity. Of course, we can think about it this way. In our relatively short lives, the most precious things we have are our time and our labor. Yet simply not to die in squalor, the only option we have is to sell away that which is most precious and valuable. And if we've never thought seriously about the history of wage labor, or the economic alternatives to wage labor, or historically the violent origins of wage labor and how it emerged, how people were dragged into that arrangement, then are we really justified in believing that there are not any better ways of arranging our world, where we aren't coerced, right, with the threat of homelessness and poverty to sell away what is most valuable, right, our time and our labor? That is it not possible for us to keep our time and our labor so that we can decide with our community how we all want to use and spend it to create a beautiful, just, and good world, right? What would those alternative institutions and mechanisms, political, economic infrastructures look like that would allow for us to come together as communities and ask these big, basic economic questions? Now, of course, our ordinary, everyday consciousness simply does not ask such questions and does not interrogate these basic economic presuppositions. And in fact, it often dismisses those sorts of questions as silly. But when one starts asking these sorts of fundamental questions, they are engaging in political philosophy and a philosophy of economics, right? Doing the same sort of thinking that the most influential philosophers scattered across history have done, right? The people who have articulated the ideas that in many ways are responsible for how the world is currently arranged. And in fact, we can subject any area of human activity to this attitude of radical, fundamental questioning. Thus, there can be a philosophy of anything. Political philosophy, environmental philosophy, philosophy of race, of religion, of art, philosophy of science, philosophy of friendship, philosophy of love, philosophy of life. All right, and with that, we conclude this video lecture. Thank you, and there will be a third uploaded soon.